Is this looking okay?
Yep, I can see your slides and your video, so it looks great.
Okay, great. Normally, the most successful presentations are the ones that get off the cover slide right away. But this is a little different kind of study, a little different kind of presentation. And I actually want to spend a little bit of time on this cover slide because this is a study of Hutterite communities in the state of Montana. And prior to moving to Montana in 2007, I'd never heard of Hutterites, but I certainly have now. And this picture actually shows a Hutterite community. It is, as you can see, an agricultural operation. You can also see it's in Montana because of the mountains in the background. And of course, the things to the left, the part of the picture, are typical things you would find in any ag operation, storage silos, workshops, etc. for equipment. On the right-hand side of the screen, however, is something that you wouldn't see, and that is housing. Housing for the entire community, because these communities are communal religious-based organizations that are a big-time player in Montana agriculture. And you don't live in Montana, particularly in the rural parts of Montana, very long before you form an opinion about Hutterite communities, and that's part of what this study is about. So what we tried to do is measure the contributions of these communities because they're in rural locations and they generally stick to themselves, shall we say, Hutterite members. There's very low levels of awareness and a lot of myths about Hutterites within the state of Montana. So the object of this study was to try to figure out how they plug into the economy, because there's a lot of Montanans that think they don't plug in at all. And there actually is a very tight connection between what happens on these relatively self-contained colonies that are sprinkled throughout the north central and south central part of the state and the rest of the economy, and that's what the study is trying to demonstrate. It really is a rather unique study for reasons that are mostly remarkable to those of us that live in Montana. One remarkable thing is that two normally competitive universities, University of Montana and Montana State, actually totally collaborated on this study. It's also rather remarkable because these colonies, as you'll see in a moment, are economically different kinds of animals, but those differences were actually an advantage for this study because we had extensive data. Like everyone else under the sun, at least in the United States, we do have to file income taxes, and so there are accountants involved, and the accountants have full financial records of these colonies, and we're really happy to be able to use that information for this study. A couple of notable aspects of Hutterites: they're very self-sufficient. They grow most of their own food. They make most of their own furniture. They build. They repair. They really do self-produce a lot of things. It's a communal financial model. There are community members, which are in a very undemocratic leadership structure, by the way, who receive in-kind compensation, housing, meals, etc. They do not receive money, wages, and decisions on how to invest, what to buy, etc. are made through their governance process. There are many communities out there. I'll show you that in a second. Multiple farming operations. They do not stress formal education. Formal education beyond 8th grade is fairly uncommon. They are more involved in value-added ag operations as opposed to primarily manufacturing commodities like calves or wheat. They're very involved in value-added operations, and they've captured a huge market share in some different parts of the ag spectrum. And they've diversified into services, and as I said, they're isolated. Where are they? They're sprinkled across the state. They have a long history. I'm not going to tell you the long history, but they originally came from Europe, and like a lot of religious groups fled persecution, arrived. They spent some time in Illinois and Missouri, and they're actually more numerous in Canada than they are in Montana. And there's a long story for why that is. But as you can see, where these triangles and dots are located is where the colonies were in 2010. The picture has largely not changed since then. So what we did is we understand that there's a lot of communities in the state, 53 in fact, You can see their membership, fairly modest. There are different sects of Hutterites. There are actually 3. And there are 2 that are represented in the States, the Lehrerleuts and the Lehrerleits. And we just studied the Lehrerleits, who are by far the most numerous. And then there's a subset of those for which we had complete financial records. So actually the study is just of those. The last dot, those are the ones that we analyzed. You can see it's roughly 81 different farming operations that you might think of as what you were looking at on that picture on the front of the camera. So the research question is really pretty basic. It's one that's been asked and addressed by everyone in the seminar, I'm sure, at this program. And that is try to imagine the economy of the world if the Hutterite communities didn't exist. And the answer is there's a lot of jobs outside the colonies that owe their existence to the presence of Hutterites in Montana. A couple of things. I generally, when I speak at this users meeting, I try to address my comments not just to people who are interested in the results of the research, but also REMI users who are kind of interested in how we do it. I always tell clients that I'm going to imagine a world where the Hutterites don't exist and see what that economy looks like. Of course, what I actually do is I add Hutterites again. So I take the baseline, which includes Hutterites, and then I add the Hutterites back in again. And of course, that's a lot safer than it is to subtract things from the economy. You don't run into zeros and so forth. So the contribution of ongoing operations is really something that MSU really is very knowledgeable about. Just a couple slides describe these colonies. They tend to be younger. You can see that the fraction of 65 and older in these colonies is quite small relative to the Montana average, and the fraction of those under 19 is quite a bit larger. What do they produce? Well, in terms of ag commodities, and this is mostly what they do is produce ag commodities, you can see that they produce a spectrum of ag products. And these are things that they get cash receipts for. So, you know, the typical ag outputs there, not so typical for Montana, by the way. Montana doesn't produce many hogs, and Montana doesn't produce many eggs. But grain and poultry and cattle, yes, we got those in big time. A couple other things, and I think this is kind of important for the study. They produce a heck of a lot more than this. They have extensive greenhouse operations, and they're growing vegetables. They're growing all kinds of fruit and so forth. And this is self-production now. This is what they're consuming themselves. So it doesn't show up as cash receipts. It is output. Arguably, it should be in GDP. It should be an output in REMI as well, but we didn't capture it. In terms of market share is interesting. You can see Hutterites are 90% of Montana hog output, 95% of egg production comes from Hutterite colonies. Now, a lot of things, this is misleading in some ways because unlike a lot of agricultural producers, the Hutterites will take this several stages beyond the primary commodities. So, for example, in poultry, everyone around this time of year scrambles to buy a Hutterite turkey. They sell them retail. And similarly with eggs, many of the colonies have egg processing operations where they're actually taking the eggs and shipping them to the grocery stores. And in fact, some of those operations do employ regular wage and salary employees, and those show up in manufacturing and food output. So it's a big deal, and it's kind of interesting to do this kind of study in REMI because, of course, REMI, a lot of us, I'll speak for myself, I'm a suburban kid. I don't know much about ag, never have. I've learned a lot more after doing the study. And I certainly don't know much about using REMI for ag. But REMI does have some nice levers for studying ag, detailed farm output being one of the most important ones. And I'm happy to report that most things in REMI with respect to ag in this study largely made sense. Sometimes that's not the case in a state the size of Montana. The data are a little screwy and things you have to scratch your head about, but these primarily made sense. In terms of measuring the total contributions, well, this is just standard REMI stuff, right? I mean, this is the kind of stuff you show the client. You show the whole methodology of how you put it together, and you talk about the REMI flows and how it all hooks together. Let me just say a couple things. about this that were rather unique, all right? And really, I think that's why I'm presenting this today, because otherwise this is a fairly straightforward study, although it is ag-based, which is a little different. So there is no payroll employment in Hutterite colonies. There's no one that gets paid a money wage that has withholding, that has, and there's some asterisks on this, of course. I just told you about the egg processing. That's an exception to this. But by and large, if you want to figure out how many people are directly employed in the Hutterite communities, you're not going to find it in BEA or BLS. There are no money wages. There's only in-kind compensation. So the families and the kids and the workers and everyone, there's no money wages. The self-supply, as I mentioned, extremely important. I mean, they're making furniture, they're making clothing, they're making shoes, and obviously they're doing a lot in terms of food production. And they collectively purchase things. It's not like they're really self-sufficient. No one in this modern economy is. They buy all kinds of things. They buy computers, they buy tractors, they buy fuel, they buy utilities, they buy plenty of things for making food, they buy plenty of food itself. You know, it's kind of interesting when you go to the colonies, they like to serve you a meal, and that meal is full of all kinds of stuff you can buy at the grocery store because they bought it communally. So how do we handle that? Well, what we did is we just, I wouldn't say we made up employment, but we imputed a direct employment. It turns out it's not an input. It's not how we analyzed the impact of Hutterites, but we did need an employment number. So we looked at the adult population, and we came up with what we thought was a reasonable estimate of labor force participation rate, and that was employment. In terms of how we handled wages, that actually wasn't too hard. We looked at all the wages that REMI thought should be paid, and we just nullified all those, and we added them all to proprietor income. So the income is represented, but it's not wage income. And so you're not going to get the consumption vector and everything comes out of that. In terms of collective purchasing, well, this is where all these financial records were very helpful. We had voluminous data on what these companies spent money on, these communities spent money on. And so we were able to simply add to consumer spending, because that's essentially what it was, based on this accounting we had for a couple years. So the results are interesting. You know, they're pretty standard results in the sense that, you know, you look at this, you look at these, the impacts of these communities, and they spill over beyond the size of the community. This is the summary slide, of course, and they're fairly modest. I mean, these aren't huge numbers, but you can see 2,200 workers, you know, 360 million of output, population, personal income impacts, and so forth. Personal income, of course, proprietor income is going to be in there, so that's counted as well as the stuff outside the communities themselves. But you have to understand that in many corners of Montana, the fact that they have any impact is heavily discounted. In fact, this was a very controversial study. It seems like a rather obscure study, I'm sure, to those of you outside the state that have never heard of Hutterites. But within the state is actually a fairly controversial study. If you look at how the impacts fall around the state, most Hutterite colonies are in the north central region, with quite a few in the south central, but there are some measurable impacts through the trade flows in the other remaining regions of the state in our 5-region model. This is the slide that people don't believe. Within Montana, it seems pretty basic. Farm jobs, certainly farm jobs. Those are the Hutterites themselves, you might say. And again, that was an imputed number. By the way, it turns out that because we had such high levels of employment in the Hutterite colonies, and they're really true. I mean, everyone does work. The productivity of Hutterite farms is actually very, very low, even though they're highly mechanized and they're very modern. And they certainly have lots of revenues, but their productivity is low because they have such you know, high employment in their production. But you can see these other employment impacts, professional business services. I told you the accountants are kept busy by these Hutterite colonies, believe me. Healthcare, you know, the typical sectors that you would expect almost any kind of economic activity to affect. This is somewhat controversial, this slide, which seems very ordinary to REMI users, because the thought is that Hutterites are self-contained. They have no connection to the economy. And of course, they have a very strong connection, and I've glossed over a lot of that. In most of the rural counties they operate in, they're either the largest or one of the largest property tax payers. They pay into the UI system, even though they don't school their kids beyond 8th grade. They're pretty dominant because of their high number of young people in the school that ages up to that, and so forth. So you can see that the demand there, output impacts similarly across the board. They add up to $360 million. Not a giant number in the context even of a state that's relatively small from an economy point of view, like Montana, but nonetheless, these were pretty eye-opening numbers. So the conclusions that we put together here were pretty basic. I mean, we're talking about the fact that the existence of Hutterite communities is kind of interesting. Everyone calls them colonies, but the Hutterites themselves are sensitive to that word colony, and so we always use the word community when we refer to Hutterites, and that gives you some insight into just how touchy and how potentially controversial this rather straightforward study was. This just summarizes the results from the tables and makes clear that the contributions go beyond the communities themselves, and that there are very strong linkages through taxes and spending and all the other kinds of things that are typical, even though the economic organization of these is atypical. So I'm going to conclude with just some observations. And these are primarily for this group here. And just a couple things about this study that I think really went well. We were really fortunate to have this collaboration between the two universities, the two larger state universities in the state of Montana, with Montana State being the ag school, if you will, and University of Montana, where I work, being more of the liberal arts school. So we covered that fairly well, but I will say that this study was greeted with a lot of pushback. And in fact, the presidents of both universities were contacted by critics of the study, told that we were charlatans and why did we have jobs and all this sort of thing. And the reason for that is pretty simple. The Hutterites are competitors, and the Hutterites are not very well understood in terms of the way they're organized. The perception is that the Hutterites don't pay wages, and therefore they can outbid everyone else for land. And those of you that have lived in farm country know that buying land and holding land, those are gigantically important, and it's really a flashpoint in many of these communities. And our study indicated that there was a connection. I will say, and I wish I was there in person, and actually I wish I heard Colby's presentation, because I always like to rib Colby, but maybe he can rib me after this, because this study gave me an opportunity to give what is perhaps the most unique REMI presentation I have ever given in my life. I presented the results of this study, much of the same slides I'm showing you, at what's called the all-colony meeting. So all those dots you saw on the map sent their elders to one of the colonies, and they all met and we presented. I will say that there is a certain similarity, if you will, to the way all the Hutterites dress, the Hutterite elders. And of course, the only kind of room that you can give any kind of presentation to at a Hutterite colony is going to be the church. So I was in the front of the church presenting at the all-colony meeting. It was fascinating. These people are very sharp business people, and they do not swallow results they do not believe. And so it was a very lively and very interactive meeting with an incredible setting. I'll never forget it. I will say that I believe what really pushed this through was the fact that this was all data-based. We had unbelievably comprehensive data on all the things that went into REMI, and of course REMI itself was the reputation of the model and our ability to demonstrate how it worked. really put the lie to any kind of questions about our results, even though, like I say, they sound straightforward. They were actually quite controversial in Montana. So that's all I have, and I am going to stop sharing if I can, and wait for the next presentation. And I hope Colby has